Next speaker will, continuing the COVID theme, will be speaking about employment law and COVID specifically. I'd like to introduce my colleague Reshma Kishnani. Reshma works with me in our estates litigation and our employment litigation department, our group. Reshma was called to the bar in 2011. She's worked exclusively in civil litigation since 2011, and I've been very fortunate to be working with her since she was called to the bar, both at our previous firm and here at Mills & Mills when I came over in 2016. When COVID hit, when the emergency was declared, it was a very busy time for employment lawyers, and Reshma was called to provide advice to our employer clients, and so she has a number of things that she's learned, and she is here today to specifically speak to all of you about employment law during COVID-19. And so, Reshma, I would ask you if you could turn your video on, and hopefully you'll be on our screen. So, Reshma Kishnani.
Thank you very much, Richard. I hope I am showing up on the screen. Paul, thank you so much for the sharing the experience of Motion Ball. I actually am very proud to hear that that you were able to maintain your staff and keep them motivated through this time, and also be able to engage in your stakeholders and keep the organization moving forward, at least for 2020, in the reactive stage, almost reacting to the suddenness and the restrictions of the pandemic. And it sounds like to me you're now in the phase of considering, okay, we made it through the shock phase, and now it's no longer a shock that COVID-19 is around and intends to be around for a really long time. What are we going to do next? How are we going to keep the momentum going? How are we going to keep the staff on? How are we going to maintain funding? These are all things that have been facing so many organizations, and on the employment front, it has been incredibly busy. Busy in the sense that there have been so many questions on how does this change employment considerations for organizations. The law around employment issues remains the same for the most part, but it really has changed how organizations need to think about their employment questions, their employment concerns, and come up with a creative solution as to how we're going to get through all of this together. So on that note, I have prepared a presentation which I'm going to share on screen. It is a slideshow, so I do apologize if all you see is a slideshow, but hopefully through my voice, I'll try to make it a little bit engaging. So just bear with me as I get it on the slide, on Zoom. Okay, I think I've got it up now. And so we're good to go. So the presentation today I thought would focus on employment law considerations in COVID-19. Thank you very much, Richard, for your introduction. I wanted to let everybody know that there is an option of being able to see your speaker on screen and the PowerPoint presentation if you go to the view function and select side-by-side mode in case anybody needs that option. It's such a pleasure to be here to have the opportunity to speak to you on this evolving area, particularly under the current circumstances. As Paul has shed some light already, COVID-19 has had an impact on every industry and on everybody, and particularly in the employment context. In my practice over the last 8 months since COVID-19 restrictions were imposed, I've seen a number of challenges faced organizations and workers with respect to their employment needs, considerations for their organizations now and moving forward in the future, as well as the key point, managing the health and safety of their workplace as they are opening up and trying to conduct business under the current restrictions in place. So given the brief time I have to monopolize the screen, I thought we'd just talk about some key considerations to bear in mind as we move forward and adapt to the new reality of working through COVID-19. Richard did an excellent job of introducing who I am. I just wanted to shed light on how I develop my practice. I've been working more on the employment and estates front over the last few years since joining Mills and Mills. And I've really enjoyed utilizing diverse strategies and creative dispute resolution options with my clients, because oftentimes, as I said earlier, in the employment law front, the law is the law. Oftentimes we're trying to find creative solutions in terms of figuring out how to meet an organization's employment needs. And then on the other front, how to negotiate and advocate on behalf of employees in terms of their employee rights within the employment context. Just a bit of background in terms of my connection with the not-for-profit sector. I have worked with the not-for-profit sector internationally before I became a lawyer, and I continue to work with charities and not-for-profit organizations in providing support, particularly on the employment and estates front where necessary. Just a disclaimer, because I'm a lawyer, that none of the information I'm presenting today is legal advice. If you need specific legal advice for your situation, please contact me, and I'd be happy to discuss any employment issues you've got facing your organization right now. So keeping in mind the challenges we have been faced with during these unprecedented times, I wanted to discuss a few things that have come up in my practice over the last 8 months. So the agenda that I set out for today is talking about the importance of assessing employment needs, the importance of reviewing employment contracts, the significance of establishing policies and practices in your workplace, and the value of having sound policies and procedures in the workplace, the importance of having your health and safety protocols established, making it easy to use, because all of this becomes very important as the pandemic continues to evolve and health and safety protocols are being advised by public health in terms of maintaining a safe workplace for your staff to return to. And then the last thing I wanted to just quickly touch on was mitigating risk. That's always a key thing that's in the mind and the front of employers in terms of how do I mitigate my employment risk here when I have to make important employment decisions such as termination, layoffs, restructuring my organization, restructuring terms of employment, et cetera, et cetera. So talking about assessing your employment needs. In reviewing and assessing your employment needs currently, with the changes, the shock that COVID-19 brought on, and now realizing that COVID-19 and its restrictions are going to hang out for a little while, and they're not really going to go away anytime soon. Some key questions you might want to ask are, how many employees do you need, right? Do you need them as full-time, part-time? Do you need to cut back on employees? Or can you preserve the status quo? Is that an option to the organization? Or do you need to expand? Some sectors are finding that their services that they're providing are actually in high demand now, and they need to expand their workforce. Would your organization benefit from alternative employment arrangements from those that you currently had in place pre-COVID? Are there things that you can think about in terms of meeting your employment needs by structuring your contracts, perhaps hiring independent contractors instead of having full-time employees, outsourcing certain services? Would that make a difference in your bottom line in terms of still meeting your organization's goals and objectives, but minimizing the risk on the employment front with respect to obligations you might have to employees? Remote working, limited office attendance, that's something that you might also want to consider. Is that an option? Are there alternative and flexible work arrangements required currently? And is that even possible for your organization? Can you redefine or restructure certain roles such that you're not materially changing terms of employment, but you can still service the needs of an organization and utilize the talent that you have within your current workforce to meet the needs of the organization? A key question to be asking now as well are, what are the organization's goals and objectives? right now and in the future. Paul's example was excellent. You know, in February, the goal was, okay, let's just get through this year. How are we going to meet those needs? And now you're sitting in October, November, thinking about what is the organization's goals and objectives for the next year? Are they the same that they were in 2020? And can we meet those needs? How are we going to meet those needs under the current restrictions? And it might be time now to sit down and say, okay, we've got to creatively think of a way to engage our stakeholders and find value, provide value to them within the current restrictions. Can you maintain status quo right now, or do you have to change things within your employment contract? Can you ride out the wave? Do you need to expand? Do you need to grow? Another thing to think about are how have the organization's needs changed over the course of COVID-19. I know some of the things that have been raised with respect to organizations that I've worked with are sources of funding. Sources of funding for programs they have changed. But are there alternative sources of funding such that your employment needs and staffing needs can be met with that alternative source of funding? Are there specific positions you can source funding for such that those positions can be maintained, and then you free up some additional funding for alternative positions so that you can maintain your employment workforce? And of course, at all times, it's important to conduct a cost-benefit analysis, right? You're looking your short-term cost-benefit analysis and your long-term cost-benefit analysis with respect to employment considerations you may have. And this really comes into play when an organization is faced with decisions with respect to termination, hiring of new staff, and reviewing employment contracts that are in place currently, and even considering employment contracts that possibly and probably need to be revised for the future and for new employees that join the team. So once you've been able to do that, you know, you now you're able to make some decisions as to how to meet your employment needs with respect to your organization. And one of the key things is you may wish to start reviewing employment contracts. And this becomes very important in the event the organization wishes to amend terms of employment, terminate employees, lay off employees, or hire new employees. First question you got to ask is, are there contracts? Sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't. And if there are no contracts, then if you're talking about termination, an employee will likely be entitled to common law reasonable notice under those circumstances, and a temporary layoff or a significant change in their essential terms of their contract could constitute constructive dismissal pursuant to the common law. Currently, there are statutory restrictions in place with respect to the change of terms of employment, reduction of wages, reduction of hours constituting constructive dismissal under the ESA, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that won't apply under the common law. Now, if there are written contracts, it is essential to review the terms of your written contracts to see what your termination obligations are there, what leave entitlements are there vacation entitlements, and it's important to consider all that to determine what is contractually available for your staff. If they're not working due to illness or any other COVID-related reasons, then it's important for you to also understand the Employment Standards Act and the job protection leave of absence provisions that are in there, including the amendment to the ESA, particularly section 50.1 of the Act, which is the emergency leave section. And you may have heard a lot about this. It's declared emergency leave versus the infectious declared emergency leave provision, where non-unionized employees are deemed to be under the infectious disease emergency leave provision if hours of work were temporarily reduced or eliminated for reasons related to COVID-19. And they're not considered to be on layoff status under a particular section of the ESA and entitled to their termination entitlements under that section until the period ends. And you might have heard in recent, actually it's not that recent anymore, about a few weeks ago, where the Ford government did extend that time and the extension for that particular leave until January 2nd, 2021. So those may be questions that you are facing right now if you have laid off staff, buying you a little bit more time with respect to their termination, and considering what your options might be once the new year rolls around, and if that extension is not extended by the government again. And if you have employees that are on a leave of absence, something to keep in mind is that, you know, they might still be able to come after the organization for constructive dismissal under the common law. Currently, as of today, I'm not aware of any cases that have been heard on this particular issue yet. That's not to say that it's not coming. But as of right now, you know, we are in a little bit of limbo with respect to the options an employee would have who is on temporary layoff status. And if they want to return back to the workplace, a lot of the times, you know, it's a waiting game as to whether an employer is going to be able to get them back to work and be able to recall them. There are many considerations on that front that would have to be saved for another time, because it's a complicated analysis in terms of what the real intention is behind an employer who lays off an employee for an extended period of time while recalling some staff back, but not others. Those are some situations that I've faced that are not that clear cut in terms of what the employer has done and their obligations under those circumstances, and the employee's rights under those circumstances. So that's all to say that it is very important to review employment contracts. If you don't have an employment contract, it might be worthwhile to start to think about creating employment contracts now that have strong temporary layoff provisions in there, that have good termination provisions in there, restricting entitlements to the Employment Standards Act, as well as capturing key leave of absences in there, and outlining the sick leave provision that your organization has and vacation entitlements. And one of the things with respect to vacation is you might want to require permitted, they will likely be entitled to compensation for their vacation. With respect to policies and practices, looking internally into the organization is essential to start reviewing your employee handbook, your policies and procedures, and specifically as they relate to your leave of absences, both paid and unpaid. You want to look at the duration you've put in there, make sure that it's in line with the Employment Standards Act, and the procedures employees are required to follow to take specific leaves of absences. You might want to look at your alternative work arrangements, remote working policy if you have one. If you don't have one, you might want to think about creating one. Consider what business tools are being used by employees outside the workplace. Consider policies with respect to staggered attendance at the workplace, physical distancing, sanitization, using plexiglass in the workplace, and policies and procedures around how your staff can return back to work if they're not already back at work. Another key component that's come up a lot is your security systems. Ensure that you have security systems in place to prevent data breaches. Privacy policies need to be revisited and discussed with employees, particularly those that are working remotely and at home using either their own tools or even within using business tools, but that do not have the software protecting private information of the organization. Assessment and management practices, that's really important as well. Reviewing internal assessment processes of your employees and evaluating performance and productivity of employees at this time. I mean, it's important to have and possibly revise some of your practices within the current context in terms of reviewing how employees are assessed and how employees are being managed and how teams are being managed working remotely. I imagine that's a reality for a lot of us in our organizations. And last but not least is, of course, review and revise your health and safety protocols and procedures, particularly with respect to screening measures required by public health. Stage 3 screening tools for workplaces have been released. for employees that are entering into the workplace. So that's an important consideration in terms of the questionnaire that should be completed by employees who are walking into your physical workspaces. That actually takes me to the health and safety protocol that are required to be put in place. Employers have obligations under the Ontario Health and Safety Act to take reasonable steps to protect the safety of their workers. Workers are defined as not just your employees, but those that are independent contractors that also work in the workplace. So it's important to be aware of your obligations under the OHSA and ensure you're complying with that. And that would include ensuring that you've got a health and safety committee or representative in the workplace that are able to address some of these issues. You might have questions about how to handle refusals to work. There is a procedure that's outlined under the OHSA that needs to be followed, where a refusal to work is submitted by an employee. Investigations need to ensue. You have to make sure that you're addressing the concerns that employees are raising. And if you're not unable to resolve it internally, it can be referred to the Ministry of Labor. As you are reviewing health and safety protocols, review the public health guidelines and the recommendations. You want to establish user-friendly protocols and sanitization practices in the workplace to ensure that you're complying with the OHSA and also what public health is saying that needs to be in place for a workplace to safely open. And quite practically, I think it's important to creatively service your objectives and goals while creating a safe workspace. So what that means is, if you've got an office, a space that can't handle 10 staff while maintaining physical distancing measures, you might want to think about implementing a remote working policy where only 5 staff members can attend at a time at the workplace, or have a staggered attendance at the office where staff come in every other day and teams work that way. That's just an example of one of the creative ways in which you can still service the organization's needs, but also protect the safety of your staff. And the last slide here is just talking about mitigating risk, right? And adding the element of a human response. I mean, it's very important just to keep what's happening right now human. Everybody's being affected by COVID-19, and everybody's being faced with different challenges on different fronts. So it's important to keep the communication ongoing, and more than just emails. Ensure you've got phone calls, and if you can, do video calls from time to time with your team, with your staff. Have goal-oriented messaging for long-term gain and productivity. That's very important, particularly in a current environment of remote working. You want to ensure discussions with employees are somewhat frank and open with respect to the realities of what's happening with the organization and the business. We're up to a point where it's appropriate, particularly if you're going to be changing any of the terms of the employment and want their buy-in with respect to the organization's decisions. It's important where possible to get the consent of employees with respect to any changes to their terms of employment, and engage them in terms of the discussion, because that oftentimes does help to mitigate the risk of a lawsuit coming forward with respect to any change of terms of employment. One thing that I wanted to highlight here was try your best to have a human rights lens as you make any kind of changes to your employment needs and termination of contracts, layoff of staff, because it's important to understand that, if employees are asking for accommodation with respect to the family status, that is an enumerated ground under the Human Rights Code, or due to disability, due to illness. Sometimes that classifies as a disability under the Human Rights Code. And so you want to have those perspectives in mind in terms of how you're approaching certain requests for accommodation, and your duty to try to accommodate up to a point of undue hardship as an employer. You want to check in on productivity, your team, check in on the challenges they may be having and how you may be able to help address them, and be mindful of pandemic fatigue, because that's a reality for everyone. And I think as time goes on, it becomes more and more of a reality. And there might be creative ways you can motivate your team such that you could address that pandemic fatigue and remind them that the organization is still there, very much your goals are still focused, and you're just going to be working together to get through the next phase and through the next wave in terms of how many waves we're going to have through COVID. So that's the end of my presentation. I have a feeling that I took way too long. Just very briefly, I've just put up a slide here of your team here at Mills and Mills. If there's anything that we can help with, please reach out to us. We're happy to do consults in terms of evaluating your employment questions, your employment needs, and discussing strategies with you in terms of how to address any challenges you're having in the workplace. And yes,
Okay.
Last slide here is questions.
Thanks so much, Reshma. Thanks so much. I just wanted to recap a couple things. The audio just faded once or twice. So I just wanted to, you were talking about a refusal to work and how to deal with a possible concern that an employee might have to come back to the workplace. What are the steps that an employer should take in that sort of a situation?
So in a situation where an employee brings up a concern, they've got to identify what the unsafe condition is, and an employer has an obligation to investigate. And if it's determined that there is a condition that's unsafe, that it be rectified and remedied before the employee be able to return. There are instances where an employer does do what they feel is sufficient to provide a safe workspace, and the employee still feels that the conditions are unsafe. At that point in time, the matter can then be referred to the Ministry of Labor, at which point in time the ministry appoints an inspector to come in to do an external investigation of the concerns and provide a report. So if the investigator finds that there are unsafe conditions at the workplace, the employer will be required to remedy that. And at that point in time, if an employee still feels that the situation is unsafe, then they've got some decisions to make at that point in time, whether they're going to return back to work or not return back to work, and that be deemed as a resignation from their employment.
So the Ministry of Labor can appoint an investigator, and would human rights issues also be called into play if there was concern with respect to?
Absolutely. If the situation evolves to the point where an employee just refuses to go back to work because they feel that the conditions in the workplace are unsafe after the investigation has been completed and the Ministry of Labor has also cleared the employer, then at that point in time, we're dealing with a different situation where an employee refuses to go back to work, and possibly even the employer failing to accommodate the employee for whatever reasons there might be in that instance. That could trigger some human rights issues.
And then your audio faded just briefly on the vacation part. Helen Duma had asked you to repeat what you were telling us about vacation entitlement during, I guess, layoff.
Helen, I'm very sorry if you got cut off on my screen. I can't see any chat function, so I'm sorry if I didn't pick that up. So sorry, Richard, can you just repeat what the question is?
Actually, the question was from Helen Duma. It had to do with the vacation issues that you were covering in your presentation, and I think accumulation of a vacation during layoff.
Right, so it's important to understand how your vacation is structured, because at the time of termination, it's important to understand that any vacation that's accrued by an employee is payable. So employers have to, they should structure their vacation policies such that employees are required to take vacation within a certain year. Otherwise, what happens is, and what we've seen is that vacation has carried over from year to year, and now we're at a phase that we're facing right now where a lot of terminations are occurring, and employers are finding out that they have to pay all accrued vacation owed up to the date of termination. Whereas if they had a policy before where vacation should have been taken, then they wouldn't be in the situation where they would be finding themselves paying out a lot of accrued vacation time.
Thanks for that. If anybody has a question, they can either I guess, unmute and just ask it. That's one way. Or within the participants bar, you can go into participants and raise your hand by hitting the raise hand button. I don't actually currently see any raised hands, but if anybody has a employment question, let me know. I don't see any additional chat questions. So I think that's it. Thank you very much, Reshma. That was excellent. You're covering a lot of ground, and obviously we're all available to. Oh, here's Helen. Actually, Helen's question is: can an employee be forced to take vacation?
So, Helen, under the Employment Standards Act, an employer can require that an employee take vacation within a certain period of time. So to answer your question, can they be forced to take vacation? It just depends on what you're forcing them to do, how much vacation you're forcing them to take, and within what period of time.
Okay, so probably you'd need to have specific information to give a more definitive answer. I guess, as in a lot of legal questions, the answer is it all depends.
And of course, it of course depends on how your employment contracts are worded as well with respect to vacation.
I think the essential issue is whether it's like if somebody's off and receiving CERB, can they be?
Well, if it wouldn't quite work both ways, because if they're on CERB, they're not working unless they're getting a limited income. It is a specific question to a fact scenario. Unfortunately, I would have to understand whether that individual is still being employed by the employer and earning just up to that minimum amount of time and earning CERB. And if they are, then they've still got that employer-employee obligation there. So Helen, I'm happy if you want to reach out to me separately. We can have a chat about that.
Okay, thanks. And then one last question related to employment provisions in employment contracts. What is your advice with respect to employers and reviewing their employment contracts at this point in time?
Is this a question in light of the Wakesdale case?
It is, actually.
Yeah. So I'm not providing any advice here, but generally speaking, the general view in our industry is employers need to take a look at their termination provisions in the employment contracts, and either you're going to wait it out for another decision to come forward to clarify what Wakesdale says, or you would want to revise the termination provisions in the contract, or at least provide clarification as to what they mean.